Welcome back to the Dershow. I've had a lot of pushback on my strong opposition to Saturday Night Live. Some people say, "Oh, you're just an old guy. You can't appreciate, modern humor. You're a curmudgeon." No, I just love to laugh. I love good humor. In fact, the last two nights in Florida, I went to see stand-up comedians. 2 nights ago, I went to see Eli Gold, who's fantastic. He does an imitation of Donald Trump that you wouldn't believe. God created the world in 6 days. I could have done it in four. And why did he create mosquitoes? We don't need mosquitoes. He was just so funny, so funny. And then last night, I saw this really interesting comedian named Modi, who comes from an Orthodox Jewish background and is gay, and his husband. And after the show, he actually invited me up on the stage, and I sang with him and with the cantor. So it was great fun. And I love laughing. I love laughing at funny comedians, particularly at stand-up comedians, and who don't have props and who don't have pratfalls, and who just used words to laugh. I have a column. I wrote a column about it. Of course, if I talk about it on the show, I usually going to write a column about it too. And I have a column that'll be out in the New York Daily News, in which I not only rail against how Saturday Night Live really destroyed comedy, but how the legacy of Saturday Night Live now is late night comedy. These extremely unfunny people who just go for the applause, and they're just completely political. They all have Trump derangement syndrome. And Colbert, I've been on Colbert's show. I didn't even laugh when I was on his show. I was funnier than he was. I don't get people going and watching 11:30 at night, watching unfunny people with signs in the audience telling them when to laugh. If they don't laugh, there's canned laughter coming out of a machine. That's not comedy. The guy I saw last night, Modi, he describes himself as the last of the Catskill Mountain comedians. I used to work in the Catskill Mountains. I was a busboy, and then I was a waiter, and then I was a counselor, and I used to work in these little hotels. And of course, we go and see the great comedians, and we see Alan King, who was hysterical, and Shecky Green. Even Woody Allen occasionally used to appear as a stand-up comedian. Jackie Mason, they were just hysterical. They were funny as could be. And there was the Jewish Catskills. They had the Jewish comedians, and then there were the Italian Catskills, and there were the Polish Catskills. My favorite guy, I'm trying to remember his name. He was on Broadway not so long ago. He's quite old now. He had a neutral name, and so he would tell the Jews, his original name wasn't, he'd give a Jewish name. And he would tell the Polish people, my original name, give it a Polish name, an Italian name. So he would be everything to everybody, but he was funny as hell. And, it wasn't political. Nobody knew. Does anybody to this day know who Johnny Carson ever voted for? No. He was just funny. He made fun of everybody, and he did it in a decent way. And guys, some of the comedians were just hysterical, and there were women who were hysterical comedians. Gracie Allen was unbelievable. So good. All right, nostalgia. I'm a grumpy old man. I can't help it. I'm a grumpy old man. All right. Today's news, a federal judge in New York, had a hearing in which he heard from the acting Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Neil Bove, about why he was right to seek the dismissal of the charges against Mayor Adams. And the judge pushed back and asked some hard questions. But the interesting thing for me is everybody at the hearing got up. One of them put his hand up and said, "I'll swear under oath, there was no quid pro quo." No, there was no quid pro quo. Oh my God, a quid pro quo. God forbid there should be a quid pro quo. That's all U.S. attorneys do, is quid pro quos. That's their job. Their job is quid pro quos. You arrest somebody, and then you tell them, here's the quid pro quo. If you're willing to testify against the people higher up than you, we'll let you off, or we'll give you a reduced charge. And if not, we'll throw the key away. And if that's not a quid pro quo, what is? Or even the more common quid pro quo. All right, you've been indicted. If you go to trial and you get convicted, you're going to get 11 years in jail. But if you plead and make our life easy, we'll give you a year. That's not a quid pro quo. I had a case a few years ago. It was a terrible case. I actually told President Trump about this case 4 years ago when, at the end of his term, he was giving pardons and commutations to people who had experienced what's called the trial penalty. You go to trial, you get a penalty. So here was this case, a doctor from San Diego. And I think I may have mentioned this in passing, but it deserves re-mention. He was a surgeon, an eye surgeon, and he performed two kinds of surgery. One was called ptosis, and the other, I don't remember the name exactly, but one was cosmetic, just to make your eyes look better, open. And the other was to help you see, because there were people who were afflicted with drooping eyelids and they couldn't see it. San Diego had a lot of pilots. And so a lot of pilots had the surgical operation. Of course, the surgical operation was covered by government insurance, whereas the cosmetic was not. And so they indicted him for billing, Medicaid, Medicare, whatever, for the surgical operation when he was just doing the cosmetic. And it was a close case. And he came to me for advice. He said, look, I've been offered 11, told I'll get 11 years if I go to trial and lose. But if I plead, I'll just get a 1-year suspended sentence. I'll lose my license for 2 years. I'll have to pay a fine, etc. He said, I'd like you to do an analysis of what my chances of winning are. And I did an analysis, a very careful analysis. I told him, maybe he had I don't remember, 40, 60% chance, 40% chance of winning, 60% losing. He said, oh, good. So I'll go to trial. I said, no, you can't go to trial. 11 years. If you lose, nothing. I mean, you lose your license for a couple of years, but no jail time. He said, no, I'm going to go to trial. And he went to trial and he lost. I didn't try the case. But he lost. He got the 11 years, and his father died of a heart attack when he got the 11-year sentence. That's what quid pro quos are every day in every single courthouse in the United States of America, in every prosecutor's offices. And yet you got Bovee, no quid pro quo. Adam's lawyer, no quid pro quo. There's no quid pro quo. As if it's a quid pro quo, there's something wrong with it. I mean, there are bad quid pro quos. One is, say, if you give me $10,000, I'll drop the charges. That's a quid pro quo. It's also called bribery. But prosecutors engage in quid pro quos all the time. So I'd be interested in what the judge does. Probably the judge will allow the dismissal will go forward, and he should allow the dismissal to go forward because the United States Constitution, here, I have it in front of me, the United States Constitution only permits judges to decide cases if they're cases and controversies. And if there's no case in controversy, the judicial power of the United States shall extend to all cases in law and equity, all cases involving et cetera, and cases and controversies. So, that's all they have jurisdiction over, just cases and controversies. So if there's not a case and there's not a controversy, then the United States courts have no jurisdiction. And if the prosecution comes in and says, we want the case dropped, and the defense comes in and says, we want the case dropped, that's not a controversy. So where does the federal government get the authority under the Constitution to say no? CNN, the New York Times all say, of course, the judge has the power to do that. He has the power to act in the public good, in the public interest. No, judge does not have a roaming authority to act in the public good. That's what elected officials are supposed to do, but not judges. Judges are supposed to apply the law, not define what the public good is. I've mentioned before, the Bible has book that begins, when judges ruled the land, there was famine. You don't want judges to make decisions involving policy. You want judges to make decisions involving law. But of course, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, love judges when the judges are imposing checks on their enemies, and hate judges when the judges are imposing checks on their side. We saw that during the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Obviously, the judges were preventing the New Deal from being carried forward. And so all the liberals, all the Democrats were saying, oh, judges, no, they shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't be doing that. And they threatened judges, and judges changed their minds, and they allowed. Then during the civil rights movement, impeach Earl Warren. Southerners said, no, we don't want judges integrating our schools. We want judges just to accept legislative solutions. But then, years later, when the sides switched, you get people on the right saying, no, now, we like judges. We own the Supreme Court. We're now 6-3 in the Supreme Court. Let the Supreme Court decide important issues. So each side invokes the courts when it serves their political interests to do so, and each side objects to the courts when it serves their political interests to object to the courts. This has been our history from the beginning. Thomas Jefferson mentioned this before, but it warrants repetition. He gets elected. During the interim between the time that he was elected and the time he took office, remember in the old days, they didn't take office until March. Now it's January, but March, it was a long period because it took a long time to get to Washington by horse. So during that period of time, the then lame duck president, Adams, appointed a whole bunch of judges, midnight judges. And Jefferson said, no, we're not going to get them confirmed. No, we're not going to do that. And it led, of course, to the famous case of Marbury versus Madison. And the Supreme Court said, no, we have a role to play. Ironically, of course, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was probably the most powerful Chief Justice in our history, John Marshall, was Thomas Jefferson's cousin. They were close. They knew each other. They hated each other. They opposed each other. But that was American democracy and our system of checks and balances. And then you get Dred Scott. The Supreme Court writes a decision that invites a civil war, essentially saying people of color, doesn't matter whether they're citizens or not, or whether they're in slave states or not, really can't be their property. They can't be part of the United States. It was never intended that African Americans should be citizens. And, that made a civil war almost inevitable because you couldn't resolve that. Our Constitution quite deliberately makes it very, very hard to amend. To amend the Constitution, you need a consensus. That's why you could have an amendment that gave women the right to vote and gave young people the right to vote, because there was a national consensus in favor of that. But you couldn't get constitutional amendments that, in those days, at least in the 1840s, 50s, that abolished slavery. It took a civil war. And after the Civil War, we then did, of course, enact 3 constitutional amendments without real participation of the Confederacy. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which gave blacks, abolished slavery, gave them the right to vote, gave them the right to citizenship. 14th Amendment is still being disputed as to what birthright citizenship really means, but this was the peace treaty that ended essentially the victory of the North over the South, the surrender at Appomattox. And so we've had these who controls, how much power does the judiciary have? How much power should the judiciary have? Obviously, if you have a law that's in direct conflict with the Constitution, for example, if you passed a statute that said that there is no right of an individual to advocate and then add whatever you want, that would be unconstitutional, because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Now, what does the freedom of speech mean? It meant different things to different people. We had a trial earlier in our history before the establishment of the United States, the Zenger trial, in which, even before the First Amendment was enacted, American common law recognized the right of newspapers to express opinions. And well before 1776, we had vibrant newspapers in this country expressing very, very, very controversial views, and there were criminal prosecutions, and most of them were thrown out. And so the First Amendment evolved from the feelings of the American people in favor of free speech, but we're still arguing about exactly what it means. What does the freedom of speech mean? Does it include libel and defamation? Does it include pornography? Does it include advocacy of violence? A range of issues that we're still debating to this day, because the framers didn't resolve it. They just created a structure for resolving it. They wrote the First Amendment in absolute terms. Congress will make no law, but then obviously it left it to the courts to determine what that means. Oliver Wendell Holmes foolishly said, it doesn't mean you can shout fire in a crowded theater. Of course, shouting fire in a crowded theater is a speech. It's pulling an alarm. It's not an appeal to the mind. It's an appeal to the adrenaline in the legs. A foolish analogy, yet it's been called by some the smartest thing ever to come out of the pen of a justice. No, it was one of the dumbest things ever to come out of the mind of a smart justice. And there's so many other things in the Constitution that fit into that category of dumb things from smart people. No human beings are capable of writing perfect constitutions or perfect documents. And so now we have this pull and tug. The president is pushing the limits of executive power to extreme points. You may agree with it. You may disagree with it. You may think he's gone too far. You may think he's gone too far simply as a negotiating ploy, and he'll pull back a little bit. It's a process. And the courts will resolve it as a process, and the courts will allow some of the authority and some of the power that he has taken to be accepted, not others. And already we're seeing that. We're saying courts come up with very different decisions. So far, they're only district courts, hundreds of them all over the country. Some are saying, yes, Trump can do that. And some are saying, no, Trump can't do that. Ultimately, we'll probably see a handful of cases go to the United States Supreme Court. One of them will be birthright citizenship. That will lose the Trump issue in the Supreme Court. You've heard it from Alan Dershowitz. That case will lose. Many of the other cases will win. The president does have the authority to refuse to spend money that was allocated by Congress. Congress can allocate, but it can't make the money be spent. The executive authority has the power to do that most of the time in most situations. So we're going to see disputes over that. We're going to see disputes over so many issues. We're going to see 4 years of conflict between the three branches of government. And used to be the 4 branches of government, the bureaucracy, but one of the things this president is doing is limiting the power of the bureaucracy. The alphabet agencies that have so much power in the United States, and they're not in the Constitution. Read the whole Constitution, you don't see a word about the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the SEC. Those are all inventions of both the legislature and the executive, and how to bring an 18th century constitution into a 21st century reality is the great challenge of constitutions. It's a constitution we are expounding, said John Marshall, a constitution intended to endure through the ages, and it has endured longer than any written constitution, as far as we know, in the history of humankind. And my friend Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the great dean of University of California at Berkeley Law School, has written a book saying, well, maybe the Constitution has seen better days. Maybe we have to really start from scratch and write a new Constitution. I don't agree with that. I think a flawed Constitution is better than starting a new process, because we don't have consensus in this country. We could not create a Constitution today. We couldn't agree on the most fundamental things. For example, First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. What does that mean now in terms of current views toward religion? Or how would you write a constitutional provision about social media and the internet and algorithms, and whether the government can use the social media to promote its own views? These are questions about which it would be very hard to have a consensus. We hardly had a consensus when our Constitution was adopted. Some states refused to sign on unless there was a Bill of Rights. Other states, of course, refused to sign on if slavery were abolished. So we had the compromise where importation of slavery was limited to a certain number of years, but ownership of slavery was still permitted. And then we had what happens if you have new states coming in? Do they become slave states or non-slave states? What about future slave laws, all of these things? And yet we managed to reach enough of a consensus to enact a constitution and a Bill of Rights and 26 amendments. We're not going to have very many more amendments, because today you can't get Congress to agree about what to serve for lunch. And how are you going to get them to agree on a constitutional amendment? Most of our constitutional amendments, or maybe not most, but a good many of them, simply corrected flaws in the Constitution. The 12th Amendment corrected a fundamental flaw in the Constitution. Otherwise, you could never decide who was elected, the president or the vice president. And there are other flaws in the Constitution, too. Even the most recent amendment, the 26th Amendment, which says that you can't raise the salary of Congress except after an election in which the congressmen are up for election. That was regarded as a flaw in the Constitution, so you could get consensus. But you're not going to get major consensus today. So stay tuned. The next 4 years, you have to watch this show in the next 4 years, because it's going to be a central aspect of this show as to how legally and constitutionally we navigate this conflict between the executive branch and the judicial branch. And in 2 years, we may see a tripartite conflict. We may see a conflict between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Right now, the two of them are controlled by the same party, very narrowly, to be sure, both the House and the Senate, very narrowly controlled by the House. But in 2 years, we may see what happened in 1994 with President Clinton not being able to hold on to his legislative majority. And then we'll see Congress clashing with the executive. Trump will say, no, I have this authority. Congress doesn't have this power. Congress will say, yes, we do. And then the courts will have to resolve it. Right now, what we see is the president and Congress essentially on the same side. He's gotten his cabinet picks, and he's gotten most of his legislative choices. Of course, the Senate still has some degree of veto power because, at least as for some issues, you need 60 votes, and that means you need Democrats and Republicans. But for some, all you need is 50 plus the vice president. And so we're going to see that clash. And the clash is going to be primarily between the judicial branch and the executive branch. Now, the Supreme Court will resolve it. The Supreme Court only takes 75 cases a year. That's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the cases that are brought before it. And so a lot of these cases will be resolved in the lower courts, trial courts, courts of appeals, and only a few of them will come up to the United States Supreme Court. So stay tuned. All right, let's look at letters. We got a lot of them. This is an interesting one. Professor, would you like to see Pam Bondi and the Department of Justice make a concerted effort to find out who leaked the Roe versus Wade decision in 2022? Of course I would. And I think it would be easy to do. I don't think the Supreme Court wants anybody to know who did it. And it would cause division within the court. But yeah, I think it would be a great thing. I think we should find out, if we can, who made that deliberate decision to try to influence the Supreme Court by leaking an early draft of its decisions. If you were able to talk to one of the founding fathers for 1 hour, whom would you choose? That's easy. It's Thomas Jefferson. All right, Tom, you're a great guy. All men are created equal. I know you wrote that on a desk that was built for you by a slave. Okay, I understand that. But you're a brilliant guy. How could you not have freed your slaves? How could you have permitted slavery in your own home, ownership of people? Explain it to me. I don't get it. How could you have done that? I think it would have been an interesting conversation, because, Jefferson really was, and Hamilton were the great minds of the foundation, not Washington, but Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison were the three minds that really organized the early United States of America. Madison was the father of the Constitution. Hamilton introduced the United States into modernity and commerce and trade, and was off the charts, brilliant. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, the most well-educated, well-read, and also very smart, one of our founders. So I would love to have spoken to him. Okay. Professor, in response to a speech made by J.D. Vance in Berlin, Margaret Brennan opined on Face of the Nation that it was free speech and the Nazis' manipulation of it that was responsible for the Holocaust. What is your reaction to the statement? Well, if you were in my class and we had grades, D- with grade inflation. What a dumb thing to say. Free speech had nothing to do with the growth of Nazism. First of all, the Weimar Republic, was a democracy, but it had all kinds of restrictions on free speech. It didn't matter. And then, of course, the Holocaust occurs, 8 years, really starts 8 years. Maybe it starts in 1938 with Kristallnacht, but it doesn't really become industrialized until around 1940. By that time, Hitler had been in power 8 years, and he had totally abolished completely free speech. Free speech had nothing, zero, to do with the Holocaust. It was the restriction on free speech, at least in part, that played something of a role in not allowing any kind of dissent from the policy of mass murder. All right, here's one about Saturday Night Live. Jack Benny, I still hear his radio shows and his TV shows, many of which were recorded before I was born, and they were recorded in black and white. You're right, comedy has been subverted. I remember Jack Benny. He was so funny. He was a cheapskate. He apparently not in real life, but he presented himself as a cheapskate. And he talks about the robber coming up to him and says, "All right, your money and your life." He said, "All right, I'm thinking." It's just verbal comedy. He made you think so much. One guy says, my favorite stand-up was Carlin. I loved Carlin. George Carlin was hysterical. He took everything and he turned it inside out. And there he was, just him alone on a stage, making you laugh through your, just as much as you possibly can. I found your book on Jefferson on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and on Kindle. Okay. I kidded about maybe finding it in a Remainders shop for $1, but you can get it if you want it on here. Finding Jefferson. It's one of my favorite books. And by the way, it has endorsements by President William Jefferson Clinton. This book is a wonderful adventure story. David McCulloch, Dorothy Kearns, and it also has Ken Burns. So I got a lot of endorsements. I was so lucky. My son Elon and I found this letter in a bookstore, and I wrote a whole book. I found the letter on a Friday. By Monday, I had written 12,000 words of the book, and by the end of the month, I had written the whole book. So it was really a thrilling find. Comedy took a header when they started taped and piped in laughter. That was inherently artificial response. We have artificial intelligence now in comedy. And I wonder if artificial intelligence could tell a good joke. Maybe you can answer me. If you send me a good joke that artificial intelligence wrote, and I'll tell you whether I think artificial intelligence can take over from stand-up comedy. Comedic folks have gotten lazy. They just don't know how to package the material without being cruel or unfunny. I'm 60. And I have loved comics like the Marx Brothers when I was a little kid. Groucho was such a brilliant comedian actor, comic actor. By the way, a lot of his stuff was written for him by some of the great writers of his day. So a lot of his comedy could be read as well as performed, although he did. Obviously, he was very funny, and his actions were very funny. But mostly the letters that I got supported my criticism of Saturday Night Live, and I think it will support my criticism of late night, 11:30, at night TV shows, which have become so darn political and so darn clapping oriented. Last night and the night before, when I listened to these two great stand-up comedians, there was no clapping. They didn't take sides politically. There were just spontaneous laughs. You couldn't help yourself. You just laughed. It was so funny. That's what I want. Thanks. See you next week.